Okay, good evening, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about modulation. Now, as far as the AP exam goes, modulation is not a topic that is front and center. Generally speaking, we kind of stop right after secondary dominance, but you may be asked something like, to orally identify, where a particular key area has modulated. So, for example, a Haydn string quartet, which we're actually going to listen to a little bit tonight, where we start, what key that is, and then kind of where we go or where the cadence takes us. So it's important to identify what is modulation and then differentiate that from secondary dominance. So a modulation is an establishment of a brand new key that is confirmed with a cadence, and that's the critical part. Okay, usually this cadence is some sort of authentic, so it's perfect or an imperfect authentic cadence. And almost always, we at the bare minimum will at least have a dominant and then the cadence, right? Just the setup into that authentic cadence, or more commonly, and it's much more stable when we have this, we'll have a subdominant in there as well. So to confirm the new key, you're going to see basically a shift in accidentals and in kind of pitch collection, so that we have a subdominant followed by a dominant followed by a tonic in the new key. And of course, these are possibilities here, right? Our most likely possibilities. Modulation can accompany a written key change. Okay, so we've all seen that where we have kind of a double bar in music and then a totally new key coming in, and then we take off into that other key. But it can actually just happen with accidentals. And that's mostly what we're going to be talking about today with modulation to common keys. Okay, so closely related common keys. Modulation is a continuation of chromatic harmony. So where you have a secondary chord, let's bring that up here. Right, here's our example of a secondary chord here. Secondary dominant, we've got a 5-4-3 of 5 going to 5. Of course, in B flat. So a secondary dominant really is just a seed, okay? It is a singular event, and we call that tonicization, okay? That singular event basically involves two chords, sometimes a very small group of chords, but essentially it is the secondary dominant chord or the secondary function chord, and then its resolution. Afterwards, we go right back into our previous key. We have no further accidentals. We have no confirmation of a key as far as a new key area. We're basically missing the cadence. We have the absence of a cadence. And in the new key, our cadence really is in the old key. Okay, and that's why we have a secondary function rather than a full modulation. Okay, so what are some of the ways that we can modulate? Well, there is something called a direct modulation. Okay, basically, this is also called a truck driver modulation. It is a type of direct modulation. Another type is a step up modulation. Lin-Manuel Miranda loves the step up modulations. It happens very frequently in pop music. So basically, you have a particular tonic, you land on that tonic. All of a sudden, the tonic becomes a leading tone for a new key, and then you go up a step, up a half step into a new key. So direct modulation happens all the time. Literally, you come to a close in one key, you're moving right along into the next. Chromatic modulation is very similar. We basically, instead of having a note that we can kind of rename in the new key, we simply step up chromatically and then function ourselves right into another key, right? So that's also a pretty what's the right word? Kind of spontaneous modulation that way. We have something called common note or a pivot note modulation that often happens with a pedal note. It basically, Debussy loves this, where you take a note that you've had a lot of in the previous key, maybe it's your tonic, maybe it's a dominant, who knows, and then you leave all the harmonies behind, and here's this one note that then becomes a new function in another key. That's the common note. What's the most useful type of modulation, and the one that we're going to talk about today, is the pivot chord modulation, also sometimes called the common chord modulation. So what on earth is this thing? This is where a pivot chord is used to literally be the bridge between the first key and the new key. So a pivot chord is a chord that functions in both the old and the new keys. They generally connect closely related keys. And we are going to talk about closely related keys in the next slide, but just while we're here, and let me make sure I'm plugged into right on the board. While we're here, I just want to touch on the notation part of modulation and how we actually, put this down in our analysis. So in this example here, the original key is D minor. Okay, we have a 1, a 6, and then a 7, okay, in D minor. And the new key is F major. So notice we've got this little bracket. Sometimes the bracket kind of goes to here, and it's okay. Whatever it is, we write the new analysis on a new line. So if you're seeing this like in Note Flight or in MuseScore or something like that, generally speaking, what you end up doing is you put lyrics on 2 separate lines. So that's the critical part, is that they're really on 2 separate lines. Most of the time we have this little bracket, and that kind of helps to delineate things as well. So it turns out that the major 7 chord is actually the dominant of F, leading to a PAC in that key. Let me get a different color so I can write on this and you can see it. I would just like to do a really, really quick matrix here. So D minor. Okay, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's do a functional dominant here, just for good practice. But because we have a 7 in our example, let's do a subtonic chord rather than the leading tone chord. So we've got D, D, E, F, F, G, A. Okay, so I'm literally just writing the names of the, where's my eraser? I'm going to make these capitals so you can see them better. I'm literally just writing in the names of the notes. So D, F, and A. The 2 chord is E, G, and B flat. And I'll just write the accidentals in as we go here. F, A, C, right? G, B flat, and D. Yeah. And now functional dominant. So A, C sharp, E. Okay. And I say functional dominant because that's really the most useful. It's possible, I suppose, that we could have a minor 5 be the pivot chord. I think it's probably less likely, but maybe not out of the realm of possibility. I mean, it's maybe going to be there. We can keep it in the back of our brain, but I do think that the actual functional dominant is probably better to know what we're doing with here. Okay, A, B flat, D, and F, and then C. We'll make that C natural because we're making this a major chord here, right? C, A, and E. Wait, I did that backwards. C, D, E. What happened to my writing tool? There we go. Let me erase this here. I went up and should have gone down, or down and should have gone up. There we go. Okay. Okay. So that's D minor. Now we know that F major is the relative major, okay, of D minor. So we are absolutely expecting that we are going to have a lot of overlap, right? Common chords between the two. So let's just do this real quick. It's a little matrix that's really handy, just so that we can see what we are dealing with here. And there we go. So FAC, F, E, G, B flat. I did it again. I went down instead of up. Where's my brain today? Sorry, I knew that didn't look right. Okay, G, B flat, and D. There we go. Wrong chord with the B flat. A. There we go. B flat. Boy. All right, B flat, C, E, G. My little there writing implement. Oops, messed that one up too. There we go. C, D. Right, D, F, A, and then E. Now I know this looks really laborious. Okay. It looks like, holy cow, why do we write all this stuff down here? You'll see where I'm going with this in a minute. And I think it probably is going to make things a little bit more clear in terms of determining what potential chords could be pivot chords between these two keys. Because remember, we're looking at chords that function in both keys. So let's just kind of quickly scan. So we have DFA. We have another DFA here, don't we? DFA. So a pivot chord here could be 1 in D minor and could also be 6 in F. Okay, so that's one way to notate that, right? So we kind of check mark those. The 2 could be the 7, right? So 2. Oops. Make that more clear. There we go. Could be 7, right? Both diminished quality. So we got that one. 3 could be 1, obviously, right? All right. You see where this is going. 4 and 2 look very similar. Let's see, I don't know that I'll have here. I'll put this over here. 4, 2, that's a very common pivot chord. And oh, I wrote 6, didn't I? Let me redo that. There we go. And they're both predominant, right? So those are very, very common pivot chords. The 5 and the 3 do not line up, right? Because again, functional dominance with a 3 chord, with a median chord, not as good. And then we also have this other one here that is the 4 and the 6. I should say the 6 is on top, right, in the previous key, and 4 in the new key. So we have a lot of potential pivot chords here, many, right? In fact, everything except that dominant, because we end up altering it in minor. The question is not so much now, you know, which chord do we use as a pivot? It's more, you know, which one is the best pivot? Because we've got so many that could be. So that's why going from a minor to its relative major or vice versa is a really, really common move, modulatory move. So, okay, how do we decide where we're going? Like I said, let me erase this and get to the next slide on here. Well, we have to decide where we're going based on our closely related keys. Okay, so we determined that F major and D minor were closely related because they were the relative major minor, okay, relationship. That's one relationship. Looking at a circle of fifths, you can also go one major minor key to the right and or to the left. So basically the key signatures that differentiate themselves by only one accidental. Okay, so this example here is B flat. Okay, check that out. B flat. If we're going to modulate to a closely related key, you could modulate to F, has 1 flat, E flat, which has 3 flats, or any of the minor keys that go with them, relative minor keys that go with them. So just as a couple examples, let's just practice this a little bit. So A major, here's A major. We could modulate to D, we could modulate to E, and then we could do any of the relative minors, B minor, F sharp minor, or C sharp minor. E flat major, here's E flat. We could go to B flat, we could go to A flat, G minor, C minor, or F minor. And just for one more, D minor, which we had on the other screen, we could go to F, which is its relative minor. We could go up to G minor, down to A minor, and then all of its relative majors. So if we're in D minor, we could go to B flat major, F major, C major, A minor, or G minor. Okay, so those are all considered closely related, which is, again, why it's so easy to find these chords that are in common between them. Okay, so the question that would be next on our list here is, how on earth are we going to identify this? Because, of course, you know, looking at the AP exam or looking at any kind of analysis, that's going to be, you know, the task put in front of us. How do you identify modulations with pivot chords? And pivot chords really are, you know, common chord modulation is one of the most common kinds of modulation. So it's worth, you know, investigating this to see if there's a pivot chord at play. First, we are going to see what our accidentals are, what our pitch collection is. So look for consistent changes in accidentals. And if you see that when we had that secondary chord, we really just had the one chord that was altered, and then its resolution, and then we had no more accidentals. So you want to look for consistent accidental changes. Look for a cadence in the new key. So you've got F major, all of a sudden you see a bunch of B naturals for maybe 2 measures, or at least a few chords, and then you see a cadence that ends in C. Well, you've most likely modulated to a closely related key there, okay? So you look for the cadence, and then you have to work backwards a little bit. Go from the cadence and go backward, taking into account where the accidentals came in, and at what point you really start to hear in your head the music going to C. And of course, we can play it as well, but you know, at least on the AP exam, you're going to have to listen, kind of, you know, audiate internally for this. But you're going to see at what point do we really feel like we're not in Kansas anymore? Go back one chord, and that's most likely your pivot chord. It's not 100%, you know, of the time, but it's a pretty good bet to see exactly where, you know, to look for that anyway. And then once you think you've identified your pivot chord, begin assigning Roman numerals on a new line, just like we saw around that bracket, for the new key. And that's basically where we're going with this. Okay. I'm going to try to play from another screen that I'm not sharing. But basically, this is the Haydn String Quartet in D major. Haydn wrote a lot of string quartets. Opus 20, number 4, the trio, which is the end of the third movement. Okay. So let me see if I can play this here. I'm playing it from a YouTube clip, so we'll take a quick listen. Whoop.
Google Fi, a phone plan by Google. Get Simply Unlimited, our most affordable unlimited plan with 35 gigabytes.
Repeat. Repeat. Okay, so let's just do a kind of a quick analysis on this. Okay, we said we're in D major. I'll do this in a bright color so you can see it here. All right, so we said we're in D major. We pretty much start out with a one chord, right? We can determine that, you know, we don't have block chords obviously in this time era or this stylistic practice, but you know, we can kind of stack up our chord collection, you know, our pitch collection, and see where we are. So we start out with a tonic, right? And that pretty much lasts a measure. The next chord here, if you're looking, we've got a G, we have a D, we have a B. Okay. So in D major, 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere around 4, right? The E may or may not be part of that chord. Remember that this is a reduction of a string quartet. And so the E likely resolves somewhere else, you know, in a linear fashion. But anyway, so we have kind of a subdominant. And then we get to C, G, and E. Okay, and we pretty much stay there for a little while. So what's that area? We're looking at, you know, maybe a 7, right? Which we would expect to have in the first inversion. This is tiny, but I'm gonna try to squeeze that little thing in there too. So we've got, you know, kind of like one chord per measure. And then we have a little motion back to D here. Okay. Back up onto the next measure, we have D on the bottom again. F sharp and D, we're kind of sticking with our one chord. And then all of a sudden we have this interesting little move here. Okay. So we all of a sudden have G sharps. In the key of D with a G sharp, we should be thinking, whoa, not in Kansas. Okay. So we've got this something happening in here. Let's see, because we're seeing accidentals. It continues. We see another accidental the next measure. Okay, where do we go? We end up in A, don't we? So let's go back. Let's see what we can do. We know that we had a cadence here in D, and then it seemed like we continued. Can we justify this chord right here? I don't know if you can see that in the there you go. Okay. Can we justify that chord in A major? Because that certainly sounds and seems like where we're going. Right? So D major to A major, they are closely related, right? We're just going one accidental up. So with A major, D is actually going to be the 4, right? So the one chord in D is the 4 in A. That's our predominant. We kind of hint at A little bit here. All right. And of course, this is the new key. Then a 4. Oh, I see an E7 chord. So then we have a 5, 7 to 1. We have a very nice, clean cadence in the new key. And that's your PIC. So we have modulated. Seems that we have anyway, right? All right, let's go on to the next thing here. So we have this new key. We're going to continue the analysis in the new key. So we've got A major, right? And pretty much that's what we see here, right? So we've got a one chord in A. Oh, hold on a minute. I'm seeing some accidentals. I'm not seeing the G sharps anymore. It looks like we're going back. So this looks like a 5, sort of, right? We've got E, we've got A, we've got A, we've got G all of a sudden. So what could this be? Okay. We do eventually end up back in D major, right? So let's work backward again. Sometimes this is the easiest way. So here's D. And it looks like we've got a good 5, right? A to D there. We have a predominant 2. It's sort of a 2, 6-ish, depending on how you see that. with an arpeggiation in the bass, we can kind of extrapolate that further, right? So we've got a B, D, and a G, GBD in, and especially G natural in D major is the 4, right? And then we have another kind of tonic here, D, and keep moving back. Here it looks like we might have a dominant again, right? Like maybe a 5/6-ish, right? Again, we don't block chords. This is, we're sort of extrapolating a little bit, but it looks like an A chord. And then we go back a little more, okay? And it looks like this might actually be an A chord with a G natural here. And that's what we've got here. So this whole thing is kind of, of course, the inversion is difficult to justify because we're, all over the place in the cello. But it looks like it's probably some kind of 5/7. All right. So we've got a dominant in there somewhere. Well, let's go back one more chord and see if this can be our pivot chord back. So where we had a 1 here for the for A major, we actually have a 5. Now, this is kind of difficult, to figure out. The second phrase is pretty solidly in D major. We don't really get the what do we want to call it? We don't really get the like official, hey, we're in D major until we start to hear the G natural. So until we know otherwise, we just assume that we are in the old key. The other thing that, you might hear, and this is where this analysis gets a little bit tricky and difficult, is this chord here. If you truly hear it as a 5/7, okay, you are probably going to analyze it this way, go back one more than that and hit your pivot chord prior to that 5/7. It's possible that you're just hearing this G as sort of an upper neighbor note, and it's not really part of the chord. And in which case, if this is an A chord, I'm just going to put this in a different color. Maybe that's the pivot chord. Maybe you don't hear the 7th. Maybe you just hear it as an upper neighbor note. And that's, again, what's difficult about this kind of analysis, because we are very highly dependent on, do we feel tension and resolution in certain places? And so someone might really legitimately feel like that is a chordal, 7th. And of course, we don't have block chords. So again, we're kind of going on, compiling the pitch collection. They might really hear that G as being a 7th. And someone else might say, yeah, maybe it's a 7th, but it really doesn't resolve like a 7th. So it's just a passing tone. And in which case, your like I said, your pivot chord could potentially be here, or it could be even later. You might hear that whole first half in A major, and then the second, I should say the first half of the second line in A major, and then the second half of that line in D. So there's some gray area here when it comes to this particular spot. But as long as, again, because we're just kind of touching on this subject, as long as you heard this ending as a modulation, I think that's the critical point right now, is really hearing that is, kind of a new place. We are, like I said, not in Kansas. So, okay, so hopefully this was useful. And like I said, it's not a huge part of the AP exam. It is something that you should be familiar with before you take the test. You should know that it is different from secondary dominance, which is what we call a tonicization. Okay. Modulation is a full-blown cadence in the new key with an establishment in the new key that normally is preceded by some sort of predominant, dominant, and then, cadential resolution in that key to confirm it.